Right, I think we're going to start. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming here. And today's panel is about antimicrobial resistance crisis. The acronym for antimicrobial resistance is AMR, and we might well use it in our questions and answers and discussions. So when we're saying AMR, we mean antimicrobial resistance. So we're going to be talking about that and what we can do to prevent it. Why is Groundswell interested in AMR? They want to understand more about this systemic issue, and it is partly driven by the food and farming sectors. But the good thing is that there are a lot of lessons that can be learned about how Regen Ag can actually help reverse this systemic issue. So that's why it's here at Groundswell. We've got a fabulous panel. We have Emma Berntman, who's an academic working with institutional investors and providing them education and transparency, but she'll do a much better job at introducing herself. Laura Higham, who's a vet turned academic, changing food companies' supply chain practices and bringing her veterinary experience to that. And Jeff Allen, who is founder of Microbes, which is a natural microbes company that uses microbes across farms. So over to you guys to introduce yourselves. And can you explain a bit why you're here at Groundswell and what you'd like to contribute, please? Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you, Katie. Thanks everyone for being here. My name's Laura Higham, as Katie says. I'm a veterinary consultant at FAI Farms, that's the Food Animal Initiative. We advise food businesses on sustainable and regenerative agriculture in large commercial supply chains. And as the vet in the team, my role is primarily around farm animal welfare and responsible antibiotic usage. I'm also the founder and director of Vet Sustain. We are a social enterprise driving sustainability in the veterinary sector, looking at both veterinary operations in terms of the sustainability of those, but also looking at how vets can use their sort of unique influence and niche on farms and in other animal settings to drive more responsible and sustainable animal care. And then finally, I'm completing a PhD in sort of sustainability in animal agriculture, looking at more sustainable and equitable human-animal relations in the way in which we farm our animals. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Emma.
All right. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. So my name is Emma Berntman. I am the Senior Engagement Specialist at an investor network called FAIR, and we look at sustainable food systems and try to share that information with our investor members to enable them to have fruitful conversations with companies, but also with global policy leaders. So my background is in immunology. So I was in academia for a number of years, and then I transitioned to work within the investor community. And many of these, so I've worked on human rights, climate change, diversity issues, but AMR has always been a thread for me, and it's been a very lonely voice, I can say. If you are working in a financial institution and you want to talk about global health risks, it's a good thing I'm very stubborn and I don't take no for an answer. So that's always a good starting point. I'm extremely happy to be here because a lot of the times the conversations I have is about this is the risk language or landscape, but being in an audience that you're actually the solution providers to how antibiotics are being used in agriculture. So I'm looking forward to learning from you guys as well. So thank you.
Over to you, Jeff. Thanks, Emma.
Hi. Me and my wife, Susie, we started Microbes about 17 years ago when we sort of discovered that there was this technology out there that went right to the base of life, where it all started, and that you could culture that and use it and incorporate it in all kinds of solutions. I've mentioned it a couple of times recently that when we first came here a number of years ago, nobody talked about microbiology or microbes or the microbiome. And yet, this time here in Groundswell, I believe there's a whole number of people talking about microbes, microbiomes, and there's been lots of lectures and people talking about the importance of that. So for me, it's kind of like, it's sort of coming home in one way, coming to Groundswell and realizing that actually we're all slowly waking up to the importance of good microbiology, whether that's internally, externally, in the soil or in the air, wherever it is. You know, that's what sustains us. It's the essence of health in every possible way.
Thank you, Jeff. So we're going to explore what exactly AMR is, and I'd like, Emma, if you could talk us through that, please, from your perspective, and then we'll come on to...
Very happy to do so. So it is a completely natural phenomenon. This is, it's part of evolution. So bacteria or other microbes, and it can be viruses, it can be fungi, for example, who will carry genes that gives them protection against the medication that we use to treat those kind of infections. Now, since it is an evolutionary process, and in the case of bacteria, we use antibiotics to treat those kind of infections. That can either just slow down the reproduction rate of the bacteria, or it can actually kill them. Now, the problem is, what happens there is we create an environment where the bacteria that carry the resistant genes, they get a survival benefit, which means they will divide, they will have access to more nutrition, more space, and then suddenly we have, as a secondary, tertiary generation, you will have a group of bacteria that now no longer responds to that particular antibiotic. Now, we have access to about 35 classes of antibiotics and a number of undergroups in those. We do have bacteria today that are not responsive to any of these antibiotics that we have available to us. And it is intrinsically linked to the amount of antibiotics that you're using. So that's a really important thing to remember, is that you can't decouple human-generated antibiotic resistance from actually the use of antibiotics. So those, if you want less of it, you have to use less antibiotics.
Okay, can you also touch on some of the systemic issues we've got here?
And since since we are an investor network, and a lot of our members are pension funds, for example, so a key focus for them is what they when we talk about systemic risk. So a risk that is actually a planetary risk in some aspect, and will have impact on, as you see on the slide there, like we're talking about financial risk, health risk, environmental risks. Now, since our network is, it's investors and it's asset managers and asset owners, the key language here is looking at the financial risk, because the underlying health risk, which is, we know AMR is here today. From the human perspective, it is about 1.27 million people dying every year from resistant bacterial infections. If we continue to use antibiotics, that number will increase to 10 million people. Now, this, we can put numbers to this. What will this actually cost the global economy? It's not only about the people actually dying, but it's also about production loss. You people who are spending long periods of time in hospitals, unable to work in the way that we're doing. So we're actually, the expected loss of global GDP is potentially 3.8%. Now, what does 3.8 mean? It means absolutely nothing. We know from the International Monetary Fund, they looked at the impact from the COVID pandemic on global GDP. That was 4.4%. And suddenly that 3.8% impact means something. And if you're an investor holding a diversified portfolio, and the reason you're doing this as a pension fund is because I want to give you your pension, both for you who are pensioners today and those of you who are going to be a pensioner in 60 years. These kind of impacts, if you have a depression of the global economy, it is very difficult to generate profit that can actually pay your pensions.
Gosh, that's quite sobering. Thank you. Laura, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the definition of AMR, because you brought more knowledge to my space on this when we talked about it. There seems to be two levels, and I'd like that to be shared with the audience, please.
Yeah, and Emma's done a great job of summarising the human health aspect of this, which of course is the loss of efficacy of our antibiotics that form a vital part of our medical arsenal, I suppose, across human society. But one of the core drivers, as Emma said, is antibiotic usage, and that antibiotic usage could be both in human patients, in our animal patients, and of course in some countries in contexts in plants and crops as well. And so that antibiotic usage has a couple of different dimensions across what we know as the One Health domains. So those inextricable links between human, animal, and environmental health. So what we now know is that antibiotic usage is problematic on two levels. Firstly, it's a key driver of antimicrobial resistance, which has impacts for human health on a global scale as well as animal health too. We're unable to effectively treat those in all cases, with rather horrific consequences for human and animal well-being. But also the usage of antibiotics is also now percolating into our environment, essentially. So when we give an antibiotic to a person or an animal, only a tiny proportion of that antibiotic is metabolized in that animal or that human, and up to 90% or 99% in the case of some antibiotic classes is excreted in the urine and the feces by that animal or that person. And of course, those antibiotic residues then arrive through things like municipal wastewater, through manure and slurry storage systems, or directly are deposited onto the land. And we know that these antibiotic residues are, of course, they're going to kill or inhibit bacteria. And those bacteria aren't always the bacteria that we want to inhibit or kill. The pathogens, they are also environmental bacteria, some of which form the bedrock of our ecosystems. So I was recently just now in the sort of pond life safari. They talked a lot about Daphnia and some of the small organisms that form, again, the bedrock of a pond ecosystem. Some of these are incredibly sensitive to some of the antibiotics in wide use across animal agriculture, but also within the human health sector as well. And I think this dimension of antibiotics arriving in our environment from wastewater streams is really only just emerging in our consciousness. Scientists have been researching it for 20 years, but I think it's really emerging now as a core concern, alongside a load of other medications actually that we're taking as people, but also giving to our animals, hormones, psychoactive medications, and illegal drugs too, caffeine even. All of these things are starting to have an impact on our ecosystems in ways in which we're only just beginning to understand. So for me, there are these two strands. There's firstly the AMR impact, and the AMR impacts in themselves can have impact on ecosystems, of course, but also this second issue of ecotoxicity from the antibiotics themselves.
So it's a double whammy. Okay, right. You've touched a little bit on what's actually causing AMR, but I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more on sort of some facts and figures. Have you got any facts, Emma, on actual percentage of antibiotic use in humans and agriculture? And
of course this varies. So a global average is about 73% of shared plant antibiotics, and these are the antibiotics that are given. It's the same antibiotics given to both humans and animals. About 73% globally are given to animals and not actually humans. And of course, on a country level, depending on the use practices that you have in place, this varies. So it's a different number in the UK. The UK is doing very well. 30% are given to animals and 70% to humans here. But that tends to be, there tends to be a lack of understanding that we are given the same antibiotics, and actually animal agriculture is a huge recipient of these antibiotics. And also, I mean, the reason it's so important for us to use antibiotics as little as possible in animal as well as human agriculture is because we want them to maintain the efficacy. Because if they lose the efficacy, we can't actually treat them. So when we have use practices that we see in certain countries where you'll actually give them for growth promotion or production purposes, So it's not even about treating bacterial infections. It's to enhance growth. And this becomes really problematic.
And Laura, when you're looking at volumes of antibiotics that are being used, how good is the UK compared to other countries from a veterinary
I think
perspective?
this is really important. Yeah, it's been incredibly successful antimicrobial stewardship, I must say, in the animal agriculture sectors, and I'm sure in the human sector, although I primarily obviously work in the animal side. There's been a 59% reduction in the usage of animal antibiotics between 2014 and 2022. And what's interesting about that is it's been prompted by the government, I'd say. In 2016, the government published the O'Neill report, which was a sort of a civil servant review, I suppose, of antibiotic usage in the various sectors, and under the Cameron government, this was found to be problematic, and a sort of notional suggested target of 50 mg per kg antibiotic per animal biomass unit, if you like, was suggested as a target, and that was very much a voluntary initiative that was then sort of devolved to the private sector. So it's not essentially a real government initiative. It's the private sector taking initiative. It's primarily under the sort of jurisdiction, if you like, of the RUMA Targets Task Force, which has done a fantastic job of this, of driving these targets down in a very species-specific way. So great progress, and the World Organization for Animal Health just yesterday published their report to say that actually animal usage had crept up very slightly, just by 2%, but it's on a knife edge, really. I think we've done well in the UK, certainly on a global level, but we can't take our foot off the pedal. There's still loads of usage in certain sectors and certain production systems, but I think it's about building on this great effort to date, really.
So we've heard about usage of antibiotics in the human sphere, and we've heard about it from a veterinary in the animal sphere, but we're also aware that there are some insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides that are also registered as antibiotics. Are they being captured in these thinkings?
I'm happy to jump in first and then hand over. No, and this is, I mean, this conversation we've had so far, this is covering only antibiotics that actually been registered as a medicinal product. There are antibiotics out there that are not within that group. So glyphosate, for example, is actually, it has antibiotic properties, but since it's not registered as a medicinal product, there is no regulation in the EU, for example, that governs it, how it can be used. And as far as I'm aware, there's not a regulation in the UK either, which is basically, it means we're spreading antibiotics into our fields. And I mean, we touched upon this before, but we know how important the soil bacterial colonies are for soil health. If you put active antibiotics on that, you will get a change. And there are studies showing that actually it can impact. These are early days, there's not a lot of information out there. But if you expose soil to antibiotics, you can actually decrease the carbon sequestration in it. So it does become very important how we use these kind of substances.
So actually the race to net zero might end up uncovering more research and evidence on this. Well, that would be good, to get a little bit more transparency on that. Okay, so we've touched on what it is and what's sort of causing it. Jeff, I was just wondering how's your understanding of AMR impacted what you do with microbes?
Yes, we have some partners in Europe that have started using microbes and instead of using antibiotics. So it's basically, many of us go to doctors now, get a course of antibiotics, and then on the way out, they'll say, and after you finish this, go and take a probiotic. So they're beginning to balance that a lot more. And so what we're also saying is, effective microorganisms, soil-based microorganisms are a probiotic. They're beneficial, they really help you out. And so by using them more and applying them to, intensive farming methods, we've started discovering that you can actually put the you can get good results, the same if not better results by using probiotics than you can with antibiotics. And that starts reflecting on the bottom line. So it all comes down to a pound, shillings and pence thing. If you can use probiotics well, it's not only good for the animals, good for the soil, good for the environment, but it's good for your pocket as well.
Well, that sounds encouraging, and hopefully we're going to come on to a little bit more detail on that later.
We've got some slides on that later on.
Okay. I just want to bring it down a level a bit insofar as antimicrobial resistance, what's it actually causing in the hospitals, Emma? And I'd like you, again, what's the actual impact that you see as a vet? So I'm thinking sort of MRSA and...
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, I mean, it's just to bring the conversation back one step. I mean, antibiotics, it's a cornerstone of modern medicine. If you want to have safe childbirth, if you want to be able to, survive with high probability surgery of any kind, cancer treatments, there are a lot of different kinds of cancer where you actually need antibiotics, or the patient will not survive long enough to reap the benefits of the cancer treatment. So this is the underlying concern that we have from the human health perspective. But there is also the academic link between how antibiotics are used within human health and how that then links to the development of antibiotic resistance. That's very clear. There's more studies coming up now showing how we use antibiotics in animal agriculture and plant agriculture will actually have effects on what we are seeing in the hospital setting. So one example, for example, is livestock-associated MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So there, we know about 10% of MRSA infections in Europe are livestock-associated. And concerningly is also that if you work in an animal setting that is an intensive animal setting, because we know that that needs higher use of antibiotics. There's about 38%. There was a study that showed that 38% of the farmers who actually worked on a daily basis with the animals were actually carrying resistant bacteria. And it was also brought home to their family members. So there was a 16% increase compared to the general population. So we have...
Can I just interpret that?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a farmer and you're working with livestock and some antibiotics and maybe potentially some of the insecticides, herbicides and fungicides, you're at a higher risk of potentially getting MRSA.
If it's a high antibiotic use system, that we should point out.
Okay. Sorry, just to clear that. All right, thank you. And then I think in your experience, you've also come across a bit more of an issue for some of the farmers. Is that correct? Farmers and vets, personal health concerns around...
Sure, yeah. I think, there is certainly a risk with antimicrobial resistance and the welfare of animals. That's absolutely for sure. There's a few vets in the audience which will be able to clarify and ratify that. Particularly, I'd say, in my own experience within the small animal sector and within individual farmed animals, you might get a very, very nasty mastitis that is incredibly hard to treat, or in dogs, a really nasty ear infection that you're having to constantly swab and work out what to give next, and it is certainly a problem. What I would say isn't also an issue is that there is a distinct human framing to the antimicrobial resistance problem, to the extent that all of the vast majority of our surveillance, understanding of, and dialogue around antimicrobial resistance is about human health, which is perfectly understandable and justifiable. But what it means is we don't have as clear a picture, I don't think, of the true impact on animal well-being. And I'm talking about both farmed species, domestic species, but also wild animals that are not directly under human care, but obviously under distinct human influence. And I think that is problematic. There is certainly research to suggest that there's some nasty antimicrobial resistant pathogens that find their way into wildlife populations that are quite remote from human populations, but have clearly arisen from, for example, livestock holdings or human population centres. So all of that for me is a problem, but it also means we don't really have a great handle on it. So all of the VARS report, the Veterinary Antibiotic Resistance and Surveillance report, that is a fantastic resource published every year, that looks at resistance from the food chain angle and resistance from animals in terms of its impact on human health. So in all of these conversations, I feel we've somewhat centralised human needs, again, for reasons that are justifiable, but it does mean that we've not got a very active One Health approach to this problem. We have a clear human-centred vision and mission, and we are incorporating animal, environmental and human dimensions in the approach to AMR. But when it comes to the outcomes, what I'd love to see more of is more of a balanced perspective around the impact of this issue across the One Health domains.
Can you explain the One Health domain to the audience? Because I'm not sure everyone knows it.
Yeah, One Health is a concept which I think the vets have sort of picked up and run with. We all have a very good view on it, and we've got a very firm hold on it. But what it means for the other sectors is that it's logical, I think, that human, animal and environmental health is all linked, overlapping and inextricably connected. So the health of a human population is dependent upon the health of the environment and the animals that co-inhabit these environments, and vice versa. So it's no good, in my view, to look at a future where human health is prioritised. For example, it has to be part of the One Health agenda, and it also means that we're then striving to uphold and regenerate the well-being of non-human species, which is absolutely vital for me for a sustainable future. Yeah.
Okay, so enough doom and gloom. What's being done to address this, please? I think we'd like to understand a little bit at a global level, a little bit at a corporate level. Maybe some of your experience can come in there. And then, Jeff, perhaps what you're seeing on some of the farms. Thank you. Let's start global, Emma.
Sure. Well, there's quite a lot of things. If you look from the animal ag perspective, so the EU, for example, has from January 2022 put in place one of the most robust regulations in order to, and this is, I think, been a recurring theme for many of the talks here, is like what gets measured gets managed, and it is very helpful to actually have targets in place. So we have this kind of guidance from policy leaders coming into place. But unfortunately, you already referred to the World Health Organization's Animal Health Report. Again, it's a very varied landscape. But in certain parts of the world, we are seeing a pretty worrying increase in use of antibiotics within animal ag.
Okay. But there is some movement at the policy level. Good.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And then what are you seeing in the work you do at FAI? What are the corporates up to?
Yeah, so we draw up antimicrobial stewardship policies for global corporations and food businesses and brands, as well as collecting antimicrobial usage data from supply chains across the world, which is challenging. But it means that we have a pretty good view as to what's going on. There's always going to be leaders of the pack. There's always going to be those that want to fulfil the basics in order to not lift their head above the parapet, if you like. And the leaders in the field are those with very robust stewardship policies that are talking about, for example, the 3 Rs, reduce, replace and refining antibiotic usage, phasing out routine prophylaxis, which is routine preventative medicine usage, as well as reserving the use of the highest priority, critically important antibiotics for human health, reserving those for cases when there are no other treatments available for those animals. And also obviously phasing out growth promotion, which, in some of the markets that we're working, that's very much an alive and well practice. But all those things for the leaders in the pack, they are all sort of by and large embedded in those stewardship policies, and they will also be collecting antimicrobial usage data from their supply chains. So progress is good, and there are leaders there that are sort of leading the way, and also driven by some of the really important NGO benchmarking exercises. FAIR is a great example of those that are sort of nudging behaviours within amongst corporate citizens, but also the likes of BB4, which is the business benchmark on farm animal welfare, which incorporates antibiotic usage and stewardship guidelines. And also the Alliance to Save Our Antibiotics, they do a supermarket survey, and more recently a sort of catering company survey that again just nudges the right behaviours amongst corporate businesses. So FAI plays an active role in helping those businesses to meet the requirements of some of these NGO benchmarking initiatives, and also trying to increase the importance of data collection. It's so difficult but so important to understand what they're doing today on antibiotic usage, and some of our systems will also isolate and identify spikes in usage, particularly amongst the critically important antibiotics, that might actually be quite a useful early warning system for a much more systemic and problematic disease issue in a supply chain. So all these things are really important, but data availability and sharing is such a big problem for antibiotics.
And when we talked about it before, you touched on in order to try and phase out antibiotics, it does require, potentially it requires quite a lot of capex to change some of the farming and production systems.
Yeah.
Do you want to give a little bit on that?
Yeah, and just to challenge that, I don't think we'd ever want to see antibiotics phased out entirely. I think vets, I think food businesses, I think even UK government, we always want to have antibiotics within our arsenal to protect animal health and welfare. Things do happen, diseases arise, etc. But in terms of dramatically reducing it, yeah, it's a fundamental part of FAI's advice to reduce, replace and refine antibiotic usage. And part of that replace would be examining the core drivers of antibiotic usage, the root causes of that usage.
Such as?
Production systems, stressful husbandry practices and painful husbandry practices that are still very prevalent for understandable reasons, that are sort of enmeshed within more commercial and intensive production systems. And I'm thinking about routine mutilations, that sort of thing, early maternal separation, that sort of thing, transport, long distance transport, for example. All of these are quite normal within conventional agriculture, but act as a stressor for animals, which unsurprisingly can result in an immune response and immune compromise in those animals, and in some cases necessitate antibiotic usage. And it would be negligent on a vet to ignore those. But what I think we're trying to say is that it's currently at the point, I believe, within some systems, species and production systems, that we're almost reaching a glass floor in the levels of usage reductions that we're able to attain. So we're seeing in some systems that antibiotic reductions have been significant. They've now reached a relatively low level, but they cannot go any further. They're plateauing, and I am speculating that that's because production systems are slow to change. And I think this is where regenerative agriculture comes in. It's where agroecology comes in. And I think it's where it places some serious challenges on farmers that do need serious public good funding to try and dismantle this glass floor, this notional glass floor, but in order to create more sustainable production systems.
But Jeff, is this what you're experiencing on the farms that you work with?
Yes, I think there's a sort of, becomes this embedded belief that you have to use antibiotics, and they become so part of the landscape. People sort of order their stock food and they don't even give it a second thought that it's already been laced with antibiotics. It's just, that's the way they do it. So it does need a step change too.
So is an agricultural production system change really required though, or are there solutions that can be used within farming systems today?
No, we've done a number of trials where we haven't changed basically the fabric of the production system, but we've just administered probiotics, effective microorganisms, instead of antibiotics. And it's a shock. There was one of the slides we'll talk about here was in a pig production unit. And there was a lot of fear before they started running it. They were convinced that all the pigs would die of diarrhea, and that the fear was palatable before we started before the trial was started, and it was on 400 head of pigs, so it was a significant trial.
Is it on one of your slides? Hang on.
Yes, that first slide, that slide there. So 400 piglets were separated into two groups, 100 male, 100 female. One was fed normally as they were with the antibiotic and the zinc oxide, and the second one was fed with microbial probiotics. And you can look at the statistics there. Basically, it's much of a muchness. You know, you can argue slightly better food conversion rate with the microbes. You know, the mortality rate, the weight increases was all about the same, except, you know, on one, you know, there's no zinc oxide, no antibiotics. Having said that, a number of the piglets in the probiotic group did get ill, and they were treated with antibiotics as necessitated.
Okay.
And
Any
then,
other examples?
Yeah, then they took them into the second cycle, where they were then fattening them over a period of time. Once again, traditional feed on one side, antibiotics, and then on the other side, you know, microbial probiotics. Once again, you know, much of a muchness, you know, but of course, you know, it actually costs a lot less to feed them probiotics than it does to feed them antibiotics. So the food bills were less, and as you'll see later, the vet bills were less.
So
this is chicken and egg production intensive. Once again, no antibiotics were used in this particular study. They were misted with probiotics. They were fed, added to the feed, and added to the water supply. And before the chicks were let in, the bedding was sprayed with a microbial spray. So once again, you know, the cost of doing that was microbes and biochar. And then you can see the savings that they had through increased growth, you know, high levels of fertility in the eggs. So it was a significant saving over a, you know, 40-week growth cycle. And here, once again, this is over a period of time of converting an intensive chicken unit slowly into probiotics using effective microorganisms and just reducing it and reducing the antibiotics till finally they stopped entirely, and you know they landed up with a zero use of antibiotics. And it's really interesting, and one of the things you were talking about earlier, the chickens were a lot healthier, the environment was a lot healthier, the chicken manure was a lot healthier. You know, it didn't stink anymore. You could actually put your hand in it and it would smell of forest, was how they described it. But not only that, is the farmer's health hugely improved. Before that, when they were using a lot of antibiotics and other additives, the farmer was getting rashes and he was really struggling with his own health. Once they swapped over to, you know, microbes, then you know, he got better. He felt a lot better in himself. And one of the things we've discovered in using microbes in agriculture in places like Australia was before they started using that and were still using chemicals, many of the kids weren't interested in taking over the farms. They didn't want to farm. But once they started using microbes extensively on farms, the children then became much more interested and wanted to take over the farming. So there's many indirect benefits as well as direct benefits.
That's very interesting, that last point. That came up in a panel I was on earlier. Here's the chicken litter trials. I mean, basically, when you're using microbes, what you do is you lock in all the nitrogen. It's locked into the deposits. It's not coming off in the air. Like, I don't know if anyone's had the misfortune of walking into an intensive chicken unit, but the first thing that hits you is the smell, you know, the ammonia and all that. That's all your nitrogen disappearing. I mean, when you take that
chicken manure out of there, it's already been deprived of all the nitrogen, or much of the nitrogen. But when you spray microbes on there, then you lock the nitrogen in, and it's much better product at the end of the day to spread on your fields.
Any more? There's one on cows, I think.
Yeah, and this is cattle again. Cattle in sheds, you can mist with microbes. It just improves the whole environment. It keeps it much cleaner. And as we say in the business, when you spray with microbes, the shit doesn't stick anymore. And once again, the increased revenue from lower vet bills. Get healthier animals. They have more immunity to what's going on.
So, am I hearing there's a wodge of solutions that could help you break your glass floor concept that you introduced?
I think so. I think I'd always push back against this concept of there being a silver bullet. There is definitely not. But I think the solutions that Jeff has developed have an absolute place in antimicrobial stewardship and this agenda. But I just maintain that we need to be ambitious and creative and look at a broad range of solutions that have to go into this. Some of which are really difficult, which might involve more systemic reform on how we raise our animals. But yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Great. Right, I'm opening up to the floor. Any questions? Oh, and we got roving mic. Thank you. Could you stand up and speak clearly? Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, I was really surprised by one thing you said about the large percentage of the antibiotics just don't get metabolized by the animals. Is that due to poor administration of the antibiotics, or is that intrinsic to? Is that unfixable? Is that unavoidable? That problem?
Yeah, it is, and it's very. Sorry.
Go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
And it's very specific to each antibiotic class. So for some that are highly metabolized, you might get 10% coming out in the feces or urine. But for a large proportion, you're getting 80, 90, 99% being excreted, and that's just normal. So the antibiotic will work its way into the system, into the blood system, into the lymph, etc., do its job. And then either the antibiotic parent compound itself or active metabolites will be excreted. And remain active in the environment. Some do emerge, and some of them can be sequestered onto things like sort of organic matter, and some of them are rapidly degraded by sunlight, for example. But there are some that can persist in the environment for 7 years. So some of the quinolones, some of the quinolones can last for a very long time in the environment and essentially accumulate. If you've got a farm that's using a lot of them, they can accumulate in the environment. Unfortunately, we just don't know enough about what that is actually doing on these farms, but it needs more work. But the logical conclusion is that they are creating hotspots of potentially ecotoxicity that we're increasingly aware of. But yeah, it's a really good point. But it's not because of administrative errors. It's quite normal. It's just the way it's the pharmacodynamics of the particular compound. Yeah.
Thank you.
We had another question here. Thank you.
Excellent talks, thank you very much. And it's really good to see trials happening around microbe use on farms in real settings. So really good to see that. I wondered if any monitoring of actual antimicrobial resistance was going alongside this, because the animals clearly been doing better in some of these trials, and it's not affecting production and it's making money. But it's like a hidden threat, this antimicrobial resistance, which, like you pointed out, is affecting potentially the health of people in the long run.
Yeah, how is antimicrobial resistance monitored or measured? Yeah, do you know, Emma? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you have to do susceptibility testing. So you'll take samples and then you basically see, are these microbes actually susceptible to the various types of antibiotics that you have available to yourself? So that's how you'd actually have to look at it.
I think the question was for Jeff, though, around the trials. Is that right? Sorry, Jeff.
I was hoping it wasn't for me, but there you go.
Yeah. I gave you a bit of time to think.
No, it's just the sort of direction of travel we go in. I mean, we in microbes, we make human probiotics, and we notice the difference in humans' immunity and the general health and dealing with specific and general issues. So we just naturally imagine that it will transfer to the animals as well as to the soil. So, it's what we're doing is we're going out into nature and finding the sort of building blocks and just reintroducing them into the food chain and into humans. I mean, it's.
But you're not measuring AMR like.
I don't have the resources to measure that. I mean, I think you've got to be a laboratory or a government or something to do that kind of thing. But so for me, it's the direction of travel. And of course, if I got sick, I wouldn't say no to antibiotics. Of course, they've been a life changer. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have antibiotics, but they just got out of whack. Yeah, that's the issue.
Any other questions? Okay, so oh yes, okay. Wait, could you wait for the mic and stand up?
I've been doing some reading lately on the potential risks of the probiotic resistance issue if we overuse it, and I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that and how we can use microbes or probiotics without kind of creating an overuse issue if we're trying to basically replace the antibiotic crisis.
Yeah, when we first started using probiotics, we used to call it microbial balancing technology. So the idea is not to over prescribe. Basically, if we don't have the slide, but like very generally speaking, 0.5% of all microbes are pathogenic, and about the same number are effective pro. And the ones in the middle, and 99% in the middle, are basically what we call opportunistic. So they go to whichever gang is the biggest. So that's why if you get like food poisoning, you get sick really, really quickly. That's because you've tipped the balance towards the pathogenic side, and all your other microbes have joined that gang, and now they're giving you a good kicking. So it's like when me and Susie, we travel in India, we don't worry where we go and eat or what we drink, as long as we have a bottle of probiotics with us. So as soon as you start feeling a bit dodgy, you don't need to take a lot, just take a capful, and it just reverses that whole process. So the thing about like antibiotics is about going and killing things. But when we use probiotics, we're not trying to kill anything. We're just trying to move the balance in that direction. And so all your microbiome then works for your general health rather than going the other direction. So it's like we make cleaners, for instance. Because microbes, they eat organic matter, so they make really good cleaners. And yet our cleaner dilution is 100 to 1. So you buy a 250 milliliter bottle, it makes 25 liters of cleaner. And so often some people go, oh, that's obviously not going to work. I'll put twice as much in it. And they ring you up and say, oh, it doesn't work. And you say, well, you put too much in. You didn't dilute it enough. So it is about maintaining that balance, not going one way. We're not trying to kill anything or dominate anything. It's just a healthy balance.
Any other questions? Great. Please, could we have the mic? We'll go to the woman closest to you. Then we'll go to the next one. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Really enjoyed all of your wisdom to shed on a very complicated topic. I think my question would be, there's lots of discussions at Groundswell over the last 2 days about the environmental land management schemes and all the positives that they're doing for society, particularly in relation to public goods. I'd love to hear some of your opinions on how we can bring the AMR conversation into the environmental land management schemes, because it seems a lot of the time the conversations are very siloed. So public health, yes, we're talking about that in relation to a One Health shift, paradigm shift to One Health, but when you come into departments like DEFRA, it doesn't seem to be like there's much of a conversation about how One Health is going to translate into the environmental land management schemes. And if we're talking about AMR and particularly antibiotic use as a public good, then how does that translate on the ground in the farming sector? Thank you.
Great question. Laura?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that one. Antimicrobial efficacy is absolutely a public good that deserves public funding, in my view. And as I say, the government have almost devolved that responsibility to the private sector. But to my knowledge, there is no explicit requirements within ELMS around antimicrobial usage, although there's a really nice SFI scheme that's obviously funding veterinary visits onto farms, and that should be a fundamental part of that herd health planning exercise. I think what is, again, coming back to what I was saying before, there's a fundamental lack of antimicrobial usage data, because that's often not required. It's often required for some certification schemes. You have to have a reference of the medicines you've used, but that is very difficult to translate into a milligrams per kilogram data point at the end of the year. So I do think, although it would put strain on farmers, I do think farmers almost need to be paid to collect that data and then to demonstrate those reductions alongside animal welfare outcomes that also should be demonstrating regeneration and animal health, and also the social justice dimensions, and the public health dimensions. We know that farming families are at a high risk of occupational related infections and risks on farm. All of those, for me, should be tied into a public good reward and incentive system. It would put, as I said before, it would put some strain on farmers to be collecting more data, but I think vets could play a fantastic role in collecting that data. Some of the Scandinavian countries are fantastic for collecting antibiotic usage data, and that's mandated in regulations. So although, again, I wouldn't want to put loads of strain on a pushed and strained industry, both on the farming and the veterinary side, there's a lot of mental health problems in both of those sectors, but I do think it needs to be rewarded with public money for collecting this important data, demonstrating actual outcomes, and for me that is absolutely a public good programme. Yeah.
Are you seeing anything at a policy level within the UK linking the departments together?
Well, what I can say from the global perspective, I mean, we see this, and we touched upon this in this panel, is like 90%, we need a One Health approach because everything is interlinked. 90% of the work is human, maybe like 8.99% is animal, and then we have the environmental aspect. It's almost completely missing from the conversations that are happening here. It's like, we don't know how much antibiotic. We know that antibiotics are found in the UK rivers, in UK soils. We don't know how much, and it's not. I do believe there's something going on in the UK now where trying to build some sort of tracking system on the environmental side. I'm not sure how far that's come, but this is information that we need, because this was one of the things that actually came up a number of years ago, because the majority of antibiotics are not produced in Europe, it's not produced in the UK, it's produced in Hyderabad in India, and the active pharmaceutical ingredients are produced in China. And they're doing river testing in the rivers in India surrounding this like massive pharmaceutical area. And they were the equivalent what you would expect to find in the bloodstream of a patient being treated with antibiotics. It's like 1,000 times higher than sampling that had been taken from European rivers. So it's just something that there's a lot of data.
So a lot of work in progress required here, I think. So everybody can take that away. There was one more question from Lady here. Oh, do you have one as well? All right. We check the time. Officially, you can leave if you want, but we'll carry on answering questions. Well,
thank you very much. I was just wondering, with the studies, did you have any ones that had controls where they had no microbes or antibiotics at all, to see if there was much of a difference, whether they needed anything? And also the fact that some of these dairy cows did improve with microbes, is it indicating that we were plugging another hole? Is there something more we need to be doing with the system, because they're still benefiting from having something?
Yeah, this is kind of quite a sort of, profound question in many ways. A lot of people will say, I eat a really good diet, I'm sure I don't need to take, probiotics and things like that. But I don't know if you've been to many of the talks here, but it's kind of like, our environment is already quite degraded in many ways. And, it's, we all need something to sort of improve and certainly get our soils to be more productive and to so get, a lot of the food we have now is so nutrient deficient, and even the air we breathe is so oxidized, especially in cities and things like that. And I know in Germany, for instance, they're now finding real problems with dairy grass because it's so missing in certain enzymes and bacteria that the idea of then just grazing cattle on there, you're going to end up with significant deficiencies. So, I think my short answer is we've done a lot of damage already, and it's to farm intensively. I put a lot of cattle in sheds, a lot of chickens or whatever in a big shed. You got to do something to support them in that environment. If you got rid of that, let's say, and let them roam free, or mob graze them or something like that, then might become a very different story. But I think there's a certain amount of repair we need to do. I certainly know on my physical body level I need to do quite a lot of repair.
Last question, please.
Thanks. It was a comment really about balancing the ecosystem, and I loved your trial results, Jeff. The biochar, microbes and charcoal, and to soak up all of the chicken manure, such a good balance of carbon and nitrogen, and it just made me, reminding me that that's it. Building the soil carbon sponge is what's going to clean up our rivers, is what's going to make healthier, the whole ecosystem healthier. And I just wondered if you had, it strikes me, I make a lot of compost, and people always, the two things we're worried about are like heavy metals and antibiotics. And biochar, which for chicken manure would compost just brilliantly. And has there been any bioremediation studies that you're aware of antibiotics reduction through composting? Because there should be some kind of law that these big industries responsible for destroying our rivers have to do complete composting now.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I had a friend years ago who approached the highways department about putting probiotics into the water runoff, because the water runoff from motorways is full of heavy metals, and it's a real source of toxins and pollution to the environment. And so he went and did a test and put a whole lot of probiotics in there, and then he came back after a period of time, measured it, and the heavy metals were gone. And he thought, I'm in, and I make all this money, I got a solution to the heavy metals coming off motorways and things like that. And so he went to the Department of Transport and said, I can sort this problem for you. And they said, no, we're not going to go with you. We're not going to do that. And he said, why not? He said, when you explain to me exactly what happens and what happens to the heavy metals, then we'll use your product. And that's the thing, with microbes, it's like we know so little about how they work. And someone turning around to you and saying, tell me exactly how they chelate heavy metals, is like, well, I don't know, any more than I know that when you ferment something, sauerkraut, it has 7 times more vitamin C in it after the fermentation. Where did the vitamin C come from? I don't know anyone who can answer that question yet. So.
Well, and if there's no more questions on that note, where does the vitamin C come from when you ferment? I think we'll draw this session to a close. Can we please thank the panelists for sharing their insights on this topic?